Good evening. I'm Daniel Benjamin. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's Richard C. Holbrooke lecture entitled Caring Capitalism. Before I introduce our speaker, Anne-Marie Slaughter, let me just say a few words about the Richard C. Holbrooke Fellowship. The Richard Holbrooke Forum was established in 2013 to honor the founder of the American Academy in Berlin after his premature and tragic passing, and his lifelong commitment to applying the tools of diplomacy and statecraft to solving some of the world's most intractable problems. The program aims to bring together some of the most influential and insightful thinkers and practitioners in global affairs and to allow them to engage in candid and meaningful discussions about the most urgent issues of the day. In 2018, the forum was enhanced to include the Richard Holbrooke Fellowship, a semester-long residency at the American Academy, followed by a workshop of international experts convened by the Holbrooke Fellow around his or her Academy project. And we are especially delighted that this year we have a twofer for our Richard Holbrooke Fellows, Anne-Marie, tonight's speaker, as well as her husband, Professor Andy Moravchik. So we feel like this is taking us to yet another level. We have not one but two Holbrooke Fellows, and we're delighted about that. It is a real pleasure to introduce Anne-Marie. She's a friend of many years, and although this introduction is about her, I will make it very personal and somewhat about me too. It seems wherever I go, I find Anne-Marie got there first, bowling people over with her incredibly imaginative and adventurous thinking. And this started out when I joined the State Department in 2009, and she was the newly arrived and dazzling director of policy planning. And while she was there, she led the work on the first quadrennial diplomacy and development review, a bold effort to refit the State Department for an array of new challenges and tasks. And it's really kind of hard to, just as an aside, to say what an impact Anne-Marie had, because the only thing in the State Department historically that has any color at all is the coding of the corridors, so that you don't get lost. There's a blue corridor and a red corridor and a yellow corridor. And the population of the State Department, which I'm very fond of, had historically been described as pale, male, and Yale. So suddenly here was this burst of color from Princeton with enormous style and the State Department. It was such a strange pairing. It was hard to imagine. And it was really wonderful to have her. And it gave us a glimpse of what the future could be like if only America could grasp it. Anyway, in 2013, I was in my first month at Dartmouth College, and I was directing the International Affairs Center, and the acting president asked me to join her at a talk that Anne-Marie was coming to give on her recent Atlantic Monthly article, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, which I think had been the biggest, the most read article of all time in the Atlantic. I haven't kept up to see if you've been lapped yet, but it is certainly one of the most widely read pieces ever. And it reopened a critical debate on ongoing obstacles to gender equality. Anyway, Anne-Marie packed one of Dartmouth's very biggest auditorium, or if you're being a stickler, auditoria. And she got the full rock star treatment. And I spent much of the next 7 years wondering if I could find anyone who would come who would get that kind of response in international affairs. Once in a while, I was fortunate. I had a couple of secretaries of state come. They turned out people. But otherwise, it was completely daunting. And now here she is again, packing the house. Today, Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of New America, a think and action tank dedicated to renewing the promise and national ideals of the United States through structural political reform, an overhaul of the American educational system, a focus on family security and well-being, and technology that serves democracy as well as forging a new global politics focused on people and planet. And as a longtime inhabitant of the otherwise staid Washington think tank ecosystem, I can tell you New America is one of the really most interesting and boldest things to happen in decades. And the institution and its CEO have done a remarkable job of stealing some really great talent. And scooping it up and identifying it too. She is also the Bert G. Kerstetter class of 66 University Professor Emerita of Politics and International Affairs at, again, Princeton University, where she was also the Dean of the School of Public and International Affairs from 2002 to 2009. There are a lot of Princeton people here tonight. Anne-Marie received her BA from Princeton again. There's a theme here, an MPhil and a DPhil in International Relations from Oxford, a JD from Harvard Law School, where from 1994 to 2002 she served as the J. Sinclair Armstrong Professor of International Foreign and Comparative Law. She's written or edited 9 books, including The Chessboard and the Web, Strategies of Connection in a Networked World, The Idea That Is America, Keeping Faith with Our Values in a Dangerous World. And she has also written over 100 scholarly articles. When she found the time, I have no idea. Anne-Marie is a contributing editor of the Financial Times, and she writes a bi-monthly column for Project Syndicate. She is routinely listed as one of the most important thinkers at work today. And we could go on, but mostly I just want to say how thrilled we are that she is here. And with that, I will turn it over to Anne-Marie.
Thank you. And I'm going to begin by thanking all of you for coming out on a rather wild and rainy night. So I'm particularly grateful to see everyone. And I also want to begin by expressing my gratitude at being able to be the half Richard C. Holbrooke fellow with my other half. I knew Richard Holbrooke. I worked with him. I was one of the many people who kind of gathered information for him at the State Department, and I was there the night he tragically died. Richard was a larger-than-life figure, and he always claimed that he was responsible for getting me my job as Director of Policy Planning, and I'm sure that was partly true. But it is an honor to be able to give the lecture in his name. And I also just want to thank everyone at the Academy. This is an extraordinary place, from the chefs, and some of you have had a chance to sample that, to the gardeners, to the program staff, to all the people who support the Academy, and then to my fellow fellows. I think you'll hear from some of them probably in the question period, but the experience of getting to know all of the fellows and hanging out at breakfast, I don't think I've done that since graduate school, and it's really a joy. I also have to just thank our fabulous ambassador who also brings style to the State Department and who is responsible for that long title I carry, the Bert G. Kerstetter University Professor. Ambassador Gutman was provost at Princeton when I was dean and had a certain hand in raising that chair. So this is a different kind of talk than some you've heard for those of you who've been attending my fellow fellows talks. This is a new project. I've been working on CARE for some time, and I will talk about that. But I certainly would not take on something as big as CARE and capitalism and expect to get very far in a couple of months as a fellow here. I expect to be working on this with many other people over the next 4 or 5 years, and this is my first effort to communicate some of those ideas to this audience. It is also not a tour of sort of care facilities or a study of care infrastructure. Often when I tell people that I'm doing this, they say, "Oh, I want to show you the daycare centers of wherever I am." And that's very important, but this is trying to be a more fundamental investigation of how we ought to think about care as part of human nature. So with that beginning, Care is definitely on the national agenda and really the global agenda. Professor Claudia Golden just won this year's Nobel Prize in economics, the first woman to do so solo. And she won really for her work on women and the labor market really over centuries. She has done many studies on women and work. One of the ones that is most important to this talk is that she showed what she called the parenthood effect, that for a long time people assumed that the gap between men and women's pay was a function of differential education and occupation. So if you had a BA or an MA and you were a teacher, you were going to earn less than somebody who had an MBA and was an investment banker. She has shown that's not true anymore. The biggest differential is within occupations, so 2 investment bankers or 2 lawyers, and it will not surprise many of you to know that effect starts largely after the birth of the first child, at which point the primary caregiver, usually the mother, starts making considerably less, and the father or is able to advance in ways that the mother is not. So that's an important dimension of this conversation. More broadly, in the United States, we've seen a real, not a resurgence, a surge of care politics and economics. When President Biden rolled out his infrastructure plan, it included $400 billion for care in various ways. None of that made it through. It was for paid family leave, child care, other kinds of support for in-home care, and it all got whittled down by Congress. But the very fact we were talking about an infrastructure of care was enormous, and largely due to the work you see of Caring Across Generations and the National Domestic Workers Alliance, both helmed by Ai-jen Poo, who's an extraordinary activist and very effective political actor, and a whole network of other organizations. We've also seen a broader effort to rejigger our economic measures to take account of many different aspects of our lives. You see there the Well-Being Economy Alliance, started in Britain, but across Europe and in the United States. The Social Progress Imperative, which develops, again, metrics to measure well-being, to measure things other than GDP and unemployment, which do not capture so many things that are necessary for our lives. And then we have a focus on the care economy. This is actually financed, largely the holding company did this study, financed by Melinda Gates, and they assess the care economy in the United States at $648 billion, bigger than the pharmaceutical industry at roughly $500 billion. And they are measuring all the money that goes into child care, elder care, both in-home and institutional, but also things like household management, which many of you will know are essential to care, whether you're coordinating the care of an elder or certainly children. And also looking at things like care benefits. 40% of employers in the United States are either going to begin or expand care benefits. So that's the care economy. You can invest in it. There are many startups, and we're seeing a lot of that as well. So this is, as I said, sort of a good time to be studying care. It is on the agenda in many ways that certainly 10 years ago, or actually 11, when I did write the article in The Atlantic, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, that nobody was talking about an infrastructure of care. Very few people, and there were a few fabulous female economists, Claudia Golden being one, who were raising these issues, but essentially it was not there. I put this up simply for those of you who know me more for foreign affairs work. When I wrote that article in 2012, I wasn't thinking about care. I was thinking about career, and I was talking about the changes in the workplace that had to happen for genuine gender equality. But by 2015, when I wrote Unfinished Business, I had concluded that the only way we will get to gender equality is if we value the traditional women's work of care as much as the traditional male work of career. In other words, we will not get there until I thought, as I now think, that my mother's work raising our family is as important as my father's work as a lawyer supporting that family. We are now, a group of us, working on care as a sort of an economic category. So I argue that care is not a service, it is a relationship, and the value it creates is due to the quality of that relationship. And now there is a group at the Stanford Center for Advanced Behavioral Studies that is working on the social science and natural science of caregiving. And that is a large part of what I'm going to base the rest of this talk on. It's a fascinating group. It includes neurobiologists who are looking at what happens in our brains when we receive care and give care. Primatologists looking at how our animal cousins give care and receive care. All sorts of anthropologists and evolutionary biologists, evolutionists of all different kinds. Child development specialists, again, who are running empirical experiments on children as infants and what happens with caregiving. And medical experts as well. And indeed, the Surgeon General just issued this report on our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And I include that because care is fundamentally a core human connection. And we are now seeing a lot of attention to what happens when we don't have human connection. So I'm part of this group, and we will be working for the next probably 3 or 4 years. My particular interest, since I am not doing the neurobiology or the anthropology of care, is actually to work backwards from outcomes, a world in which we have support for care, we value care, care is an essential part of human well-being. I want to move backward to the assumptions that we make about human nature in the first place. So here, and for the Germans among you, I found a German version of Homo economicus, and very nice, a woman as an example of Homo economicus. And many of you will know this is the kind of, from Adam Smith forward, this abstract notion of a perfectly rational utility maximizer that is the basis of traditional economic thinking. This has been debunked in many different ways, and I'm not going to go through them here. The idea of bounded rationality, nobody is perfectly rational, it's impossible. Behavioral economics, all the work of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky and all of their disciples. Demonstrations of reproductive altruism, ways in which we sacrifice our interests for the interests of our descendants. Social conditioning, and what Margaret Levy and John Ahlquist talk about, communities of fate, where you put the interests of others equal to your own because you share a broad community. I accept all of that. Many people have said Homo economicus needs to go. But the question is, what do we replace it with? Because we have models underlying all of our work, whether it's our policy work or our academic work. We are making assumptions about that basic unit of humanity, and I want to look at what those assumptions should be. So Hilary Cottam and I came up with the idea. Hilary Cottam is a social designer and kind of experimental policy intellectual and worker in Britain, came up with the idea of sapiens integra. You don't have to pay that much attention to the Latin, but it seemed to, when we were replacing Homo economicus, we should have some Latin. But the idea of sapiens integra is someone who seeks to develop her unique self. We certainly believe in that. Women have fought for centuries to be able to develop our unique selves, and this is important, to develop strong relationships with others. And what is particularly important is that those relationships are not means to an end. We have plenty of evidence of that, all of cooperation, reciprocity. This says something different. This says that the desire to connect and belong, to be in thick connection with others, is an end in itself. So if we start from that proposition, then we're really talking not about a rational agent with preferences, but with a human being with needs. And here many of you will know Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which psychologists have used, sort of going up from basic physiological needs. It does get to love and belonging. That's third up on the in the hierarchy, and all the way up to self-actualization. We want, in this work, I want to propose a different approach, and this is here still very preliminary, and I welcome your questions. But it is based on the science and on the evolutionary biology, so that a human infant is a being who, over her development, absolutely will have separation and individuation, but from the very beginning also needs connection. So if you think about it, we are born connected. If we're mammals, we're born connected to our biological mothers. We are then separated as the cord is cut, and then we are immediately reconnected or we will not survive. And we are reconnected for love and care, possibly lactation, but not necessarily. But we definitely have to have that strong relationship or we won't make it for a day. So the proposition is that we simultaneously need both. We need connection, but also separation. We need relationships with others. And if you think about it, women have traditionally been defined as wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, only in relation to others. We fought to be able to be to have identities as ourselves, but we don't give up those other relations. And that the modality for those relationships is care broadly defined, or competition is one of the main ways that we individuate ourselves. And then the sort of state from that is then belonging and winning. I'm not sure the words are exactly in the right places, but that concept of being dual is at the core of understanding care. So then, if we start from that being that seeks connection and separation, care and competition, what would happen if our social and economic systems were based on that individual? Whether you call it sapiens integra, or if you just say, what if we made policy? What if we based all of our work on a concept of whole people that is grounded in our evolution, in our brains, and in all the science that we are now doing to understand the impact of care? And I should add here, it's not just getting care, it's giving care. We evolve to do both. Obviously, we have to get care, but we also evolve to give care, and we can talk about that in the question period. The last thing I will say about care before moving to the thought experiment, these two sides of human nature are intimately related. One of the very interesting experiments that they've done with toddlers is to show that if a caregiver, if a parent, a thick caregiver, somebody that provides security to the toddler is present, the toddler will be much more curious and explore much more. So that actually the one is necessary for the other. And that it makes sense for evolutionary purposes that you have the caregiver who can provide basic safety, and only then can you do the exploration and express the curiosity that you need to grow as an individual. All right, here's our thought experiment. So here, I can't really tell you all about care and capitalism in 30 minutes, and we can talk about it, but just very, very schematically, if we think about liberalism or libertarianism as free market, the people will care for each other, the market will somehow figure it out. We know that care is actually a classic example of market failure, but you could imagine that idea, and in many parts of the U.S., that is where we are. The state does not provide. Versus a much more social democratic system where we expect the state to provide. So if you think about in France, you have a crèche. All children go to a crèche. Many American mothers long for such a system. But the idea is that is provided by the state. This model would actually think much more of the state as enabling humans to care for one another, where possible. It doesn't rule out state-provided care, absolutely not. You can have a mixed system, but it does assume that it is a core dimension of who we are and of our satisfaction through life, and the state should enable us to be able to care for those we love. And again, that can be biological or non-biological. Families can be constructed in many ways. So that, if you just think broadly, and there are a lot of scholars doing work on sort of alternatives, obviously, to the dichotomy. But I think starting from care, again, gives us a particular lens. And then think about specific policies. So labor policy, and I should start by just saying, because you can't maybe all see this, this is a cartoon in which there is a woman in a business suit who is going out to work, and her husband is holding the child, and he says, oh no, if you're going to be primary breadwinner, I get to be primary caregiver. This is a conversation my husband and I had a number of times, and it assumes that there's this dichotomy, that somebody's the breadwinner and the other person's the caregiver, or at least the primary breadwinner and caregiver. I think if we really assume that this is a core part of human nature and we need to take account of that for us all to thrive, then it makes much more sense to think of all workers as also being caregivers at some point in their lives. Many of them will be fathers, 80%. Many others will need to care for another family member, and then later in their careers for their own parents. And 40% of the family caregivers in the United States, so family caregivers caring for an adult, this does not include childcare, 40% are men, and it's growing. Precisely because as women work, they are not taking care of their parents and their husband's parents, as traditionally happened. So we would think about labor policy, at least traditionally happened in my family, but we would think about labor policy. Of course, we'd have paid leave, but we'd also have various ways of allowing people to take time out. We'd expect them to take time out, and we would structure our teams so that people could step in for one another, and that it would be expected at different times in a worker's career, we would be making room for care. Think about housing policy, something that is very much on the agenda in the United States. We have a tremendous housing crisis. So if you thought about your basic unit as a being that is both going to work, but also going to care for others, you would think of a house as the container for that care. And again, you can imagine constructed families or biological families. Some of us win the lottery and have relatives we really want to be with, and not all of us do. But we would think about how can we enable people to be able to care for one another. And again, care here is defined much more broadly than simply physical care. It's the emotional care. It's the ways in which we enable others to flourish. So we would think much more about multi-generational living, and that's actually a picture of a house that's designed for multi-generational living. That is starting to happen in California because the housing crunch is so great that they are rezoning to allow what are called alternative dwelling units, which basically mean you can create another apartment over your garage. You can rent that. But increasingly, family members are moving in. As my generation ages, and as the millennials have children, your parents move in and help with your kids, and then you help with your parents. But similarly, why don't we think about the housing, the loss of housing, as just as important as the unemployment rate? Why don't we have a national housing loss rate from evictions, from foreclosures, from disasters? Not having houses means human beings cannot care for one another, cannot support one another, cannot flourish. Similarly, we would create an entire category of special benefits for families with children under 5. We do that for seniors. I just turned 65, and all sorts of things happen. Now I get government-supported health care. Now I get all sorts of discounts, which I'm too vain to take. We get special social insurance. And the United States and most countries recognize that elders need special protection. But families with children under 5, families with 2 children generally have see a $15,000 drop in income because one or both have lower earning capacity. But there are also enormous expenses. Child care for 2 children a couple of years ago cost more than the cost of rent in all 50 states. It's a staggering cost. And then, of course, just the expenses of children, all the things that they need, the extra health care that they need. So if we were really thinking about how do we enable care, because we have to enable the caring side of us as much as the working individual side, then we would think about families with children under 5 as a special class. We'd also recognize that the care in those years is shaping those brains and will determine what they can learn, not just what they can learn, but how much they can learn for the rest of their lives. Finally, just turning for a minute to politics, and then I'll turn to international relations very briefly. We know that strong community connections are important for democracy. This was Robert Putnam's original book, Democracy in Italy, where he looked at the different provinces in Italy and discovered that the ones that had the most civic groups, including choral groups, people singing together, were the ones that had the strongest democracy. And if you think about Poland, you think about the various countries in Eastern Europe back in the 80s, again, the ones with strong civil society were the ones that had the human connection that then strengthened democracy. You can see that moving in different directions. So in Poland, you had civil society that then became political, and now we've seen that in a number of countries. Right now, in Israel, I am informed by an Israeli general and someone who's been deeply involved for decades that the political groups that formed to fight judicial reform have turned into the support groups for the victims of the Hamas attack. So shifting from politics back to a civic purpose, as well as a civic purpose to a political purpose. And here, the mention of Civic Lex, there's a picture of a map. It's an organization in Lexington, Kentucky that brings together neighborhoods to do redistricting maps themselves, to give them a feeling that they are in fact participating in their politics. But really what they're doing is building strong connections. In international relations, we could talk for a long time, but we're not going to. I have worked on networks for 30 years. I am now convinced that we need to go beyond simply the connections of networks for, climate change, in disease, for any global problem, and for lots of global politics, we operate through global networks. I think we increasingly need to think about how do we actually get networks where the nodes are smaller groups. So you see the Dunbar number of 150 relationships, which is what the average person can maintain. How do we think about creating groups who have strong enough relationships to actually work together, make change, who are then connected in these larger networks? It's also very important for things like migration. You see there the Welcome Connect. This is a group in the United States that is mobilizing groups of neighbors to welcome migrants. So you create a community and then invite specific migrants to sponsor, but also to help. So there are many implications there. Again, just this week, as I was preparing this talk, there was an article in the New York Times by Mikhail Manikin, who runs an organization called the Faithful Left, which is faith groups, and particularly Orthodox Jews on the left. And he's writing about how important it is for the Israelis to get the hostages back. And he says it's a tenet of Jewish law always to return the prisoner. And the reason is because it is the emblem of communal responsibility. If one member of your community is suffering, is taken, you must bring that person back, and that is the foundation of the communal solidarity that many of us who have been to Israel have witnessed. But what he then says, and I would say, yes, those hostages, but also the American hostages and those many captured in Gaza, but he says a call for communal care, both in Israel and worldwide, is necessary right now. And I thought it was a lovely expression of what care in global politics could look like. So I'm going to end there. Here's what I hope you take away from this talk. When you hear care, you no longer think woman. You no longer think women's nurturing, caring instincts. Some of us are, some of us aren't. But importantly, care is a dimension of human nature, not of women's nature, of all humans. We evolve to live in society. We evolve to have children with long childhoods. We evolve to give care. Indeed, one neurobiologist calls it a species-specific stimulus, that our species does not develop without it. And we cannot flourish as a society, as an economy, as a political system, unless we build care in to our basic concept of human nature. Thank you very much.
I think you're onto something here. Well, it was a terrific talk, and it's a subject that is just so staggeringly large that it's hard to get your arms around it. And so all of my questions, I'm going to turn it over to the audience really quickly so as not to embarrass myself with too many stupid questions. But the first question that occurred to me is the juxtaposition between that great remark that care is an end in itself on the one hand, and yet so often the way we talk about care is in terms of really financial inequality of care. And I'm kind of wondering, how are we going to sort this out? On the one hand, caregivers are, woefully undervalued in our society. On the other hand, you take all kinds of risks of unintended consequences if you just turn it into a dollar sign. And so, tell me why I'm wrong here now.
No, you've put your finger on a very important question, and one that many of us struggle with. Traditionally, care was a labor of love. So, of course, you shouldn't pay for it. And indeed, to commodify it changes its nature. So if you paid me for taking care of my parents or my child, that would suddenly make it a commercial transaction, and it would change the very core of it. That is true. I think part of what, though, you can do in that regard is to value it. So we could include it in calculations for Social Security. We could recognize it as a valuable contribution to the economy without paying people directly for it. And we could value it socially, so that when somebody says, I am taking care of my children, somebody doesn't turn away and talk to the lawyer, right? That we could recognize that that is just as important an activity. At the same time, and you really do have to look at both of these, the valuing of care that is non-commercial, we also need commercial care, and we need it for many reasons. And there, if you say we value it, then there you do have to value it with more money, with more social protections, with all the things that would give you the kind of care workforce that, frankly, if you're the person being taken care of, you want. But it is a deep tension, because you don't want to deny that it is a labor of love. But the fact that it's a labor of love does not mean it shouldn't be valued either commercially for those who do it for money, or in all the other ways we express value.
I do want to invite people who are watching on Zoom to send in their questions. Just make sure that you do it in the Q&A section of the Zoom platform. what do you see as the biggest impediment to creating an economy that values care? Simply the novelty of it, died in, or I should say, bred in the bone, possessive individualism. Where would you start this effort once you get beyond the really easy work of thinking it through?
So I'm going to speak. Yeah, right. I'm going to speak for the United States because I can't. But the quickest way to do that in the United States would be to remove every male member of Congress who has a wife at home. I'm not joking. I mean, really, there's very little understanding that this is completely essential for human beings.
Who does or doesn't have a wife at home?
Who does. In other words, the people making these decisions never had to take care of their children and expect that their wives were there to take children. And if you change that, including Senator Manchin and many others, and you see this among younger people, and younger conservatives as well, it's not just a Democratic thing, where people understand in the first place they can't survive unless both parties work. And that means then there has to be more support for things like paid leave. So that's the fastest way
that's
to
a very
change that.
Practical approach. Get rid of it. What's your second choice?
The second, it is coming. I mean, I really mean it that in 2012, as I said, I wasn't thinking about these issues, and it was between 2012 and 2015 that I spent a lot of time familiarizing myself with what I call care feminism. So Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique in 1961 about, bored suburban white prosperous suburban housewives, who wanted to be in the workforce, and that was second wave feminism. In 1981, she wrote a book really about the need to value care and to create an infrastructure. Nobody paid attention to it, and feminists, including feminists in my generation, did not want to touch it. I mean, we wanted to be, like our fathers. There were a group of really wonderful economists who did this work, but it was still invisible until really the last decade. So first, the drive for paid family leave. In the United States, you have a baby and you get no paid leave, right? You can get unpaid leave if you work for a corporation that has more than 50 people. So that, and then increasingly the rising cost of care. So I think as first place, no question, the increase in women politicians, but again, in men who have very different family situations. And I think an increasing recognition that unless we provide this infrastructure, we're really economically at a disadvantage. It's coming. It needs to be speeded up, but it is coming.
Yeah. Do you think that the huge demographic shift we're living through may actually be a big prod towards this? I mean, the problem, if people are going to live to 100, 110 in their last 50 years, 40 years, they're not in the workforce, we've got a really big challenge, and it's quite dramatic how things are changing and how quickly they're changing.
Gosh, so yes, and younger people are going to just basically want to bump us off.
I'll speak for yourself.
The idea, I'm thinking of tenure, right? If you're tenured till you're 95 and there are no younger people. But when you said a demographic shift, I actually thought you meant something else, and I will answer the question the way you posed it. But I was thinking, by 2040, 2045, we will not have a white majority in the United States. And already for Americans under 18, there's no white majority. For Americans under 30, it'll be 2027. And frankly, you're seeing some of those splits right now on college campuses. If you think about every other culture other than white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture, which of course is still not dominant, but dominant culturally, it's not necessarily demographically, but African-American culture, Hispanic culture, Indian American, Asian American of many different kinds, all of them are more family oriented in the sense of more extended families, depending on families, and the whole nuclear family idea is a construction of the 1950s. So I think as we see that demographic change, and I was going to write an article with Indra Nooyi, who is the CEO of Pepsi, on multi-generational housing, because she said, I never could have been CEO unless we had the Hindu compound. Right, that her mother was there, various other relatives. So that, I think, is going to be critical. The aging, yes, I mean, no question, we're going to invest a lot more in elder care. That isn't where we should be putting all that money. We need to be putting it in childcare. You know, older people vote and babies don't.
I wasn't suggesting that was the right thing. I was just saying it was an urgent thing. And it, you know, most of us have discussed at some point how the thing that we as a generation all have in common is that we all have, you know, increasingly elderly parents who are living for a long time, which is great. But as a social challenge, it's a big deal.
Well, you should invest in aging in place.
Yeah.
Aging in place and and the technology that will enable people to age in place, because there's no question that's what we want.
Right. And then, you know, there's the additional question, where does care end? I mean, teachers ought to be integrated into the care economy, right?
Yes.
I mean, so I'm just it's an interesting question. What are the boundaries of care, or is that the wrong way to think about it entirely?
So in Unfinished Business, I used a little book by a philosopher, Philip, I don't think he's a very noted philosopher, but a philosopher named Milton Meyendorff, who wrote a book called On Caring from 1971. So it's 1971. He's not a feminist. He was a father. And he writes about care as self-actualization through investment in another, so that you are enabling another to flourish. And as you do that, you yourself are growing in various ways. That definition, absolutely, it includes the classic kinds of care. It includes all coaching. When I define the care economy, I say, look at the explosion of coaching, which is a fancy word for therapy and makes people feel better about it in the workplace. But all kinds of coaches, all kinds of mentors, guides, navigators, these are all care jobs. And teachers, absolutely. That is, what else are you doing as a teacher? You're trying to light a spark. So it's not infinite, but I certainly would include anything that is helping people develop and flourish.
Well, I have to say that in the United States in particular, we have a lot of intellectual reinvention to be done, when I just consider how totally undervalued the teaching profession has been for so long, and how fortunate people of our generation were that we had either idealistic people who came out of the 60s or out of the Depression who were still teaching. Yeah. And it's quite a disaster that we haven't valued it more. So I could ask more stupid questions, but I think it's time to invite the ambassador to ask a good question. She's the ambassador. Her question will be a good question. Yes.
But is this really on? No, I don't think it is.
Oh, I thought it was.
Fake on. So I pretend it's on? I have a loud enough voice, I think. So I'm totally convinced by all of your analysis. And I thought, and Regina took the picture, right, of the chart with the little baby who separates.
Right.
So there's connection, separation, and caring and winning. It's
competition.
Competition, you know it.
Right.
That defines, the left-hand column defines the female stereotype and the right-hand column defines the male stereotype. They're both equally false, right? And you have made a compelling case that care and capitalism have to come together to correct that whole worldview. So here's my question, because I totally agree with I think your project is brilliant, and I really...
I can go home happy.
You can go home happy. Here, the big question, it reminds me, so Joe Biden, when he was out of a job after being vice president, but I gave him a job at Penn, right? He got up in front. No, he actually said, Madam President, you're my boss. When he got the Presidential Medal of Freedom, it was wonderful. I thought I died and went to heaven. So here's the question. He got up in front of a group of like thousands of Penn students, and he said to them, you have the greatest ideals. And he went on and complimented them until he came to his punchline. He said, but you are terrible at politics. And if 10% more of you had voted in the last election, the results would have been totally different. And he pointed his finger at them and he said, you got what you deserved. And they gave him a standing ovation because he was right. But that's my question to you, is the politics of this. It's young people get what you're saying and they will be enlightened by what you say. But old people, with the exceptions of those of us old people in the room, most of us don't, our cohort doesn't vote for this politics. And if you're going to change the Congress, I thought your answer was brilliant, but it was too platonic, right? The republic, you create the republic by banishing everybody over 13. Well, the divide is more like 30 or 40 years old.
Right.
So what's your so sorry for the long preface. The question is, you're a political scientist like I am. What's the politics of this?
Yeah.
Open question.
No. And there's a reason that we're starting with the social science of caregiving, right? To try to get it truly grounded so that it doesn't just sound like this is a women's issue, or, et cetera. So I think, the first answer is you do it in the states that you can do it, and you demonstrate, just as you did with healthcare, although we're certainly not there with healthcare, but we're better off, the advantages of it, right? And in fact, and there are a number of states that are really determined to create this infrastructure on the grounds that will, on instrumental grounds. So they're not on my sort of fundamental grounds, but that will strengthen their economy, that will keep women in the labor force. I think right now, that's where I would be putting my energies, and that's where paid family leave has been putting its energies. I think increasingly also building coalitions, and this you can actually do in workplaces, of parents rather than of women. And I've seen this in various corporations when on the speaking circuit, where I'm speaking to the PIMCO parents but I think that's important to get people in the workplace, men also, thinking about what are the policies you need, but then thinking, and this is also true, I run an organization, it's true of anybody who does, the burden on your employees of not, and on you as you have to offer these benefits, of not having this publicly provided. So I'd work at the state level, I'd work within corporations. I think there is also, we tried to do it through infrastructure. It didn't work, right? We really tried hard to say it is just as important as ports and roads, and our generation said, nope, ports and roads. So there may be a better strategy. You always lead with children, but I agree with you. Grandparents care about their grandparents, but not other people's children. And I don't have an answer for that. There are lots of us thinking about it. I think it'd be interesting to see if you could build grandparent coalitions. That might be another way to go.
I think you could build young people. Young people would vote more, I think, if that issue, the issue you're advocating, were
maybe so. Yep.
Because it really affects them in their daily life.
Yep.
So I think you may have a really important wedge issue for young people to get them out to vote, if you can get it on the agenda.
We will take that back to New America. We're working it.
We go right over here.
Thank you very
Nothing
much.
like coming to Berlin to be questioned by your former Princeton professors. Philip was never my professor, but
Okay, from now on, if you're from Princeton, you have to make the funny sign or something.
After that, what can I say?
it was a great talk.
I would like to follow Amy's lead in. It strikes me that one thing would be, because I entirely sign up to the substantive sort of policies you're talking about and the image you're talking about. And I like the idea of sapiens integra. But I think what you need in politics is a rhetoric in which to sell it. And the trouble is we're dominated by, there's a rhetoric of the night watchman state with the individual who sort of looks after himself or herself or whatever is self-standing. And then there's the pilloried image of the nanny state, where the individual is represented as someone who's the consumer of these government services. And these have dominated our rhetoric in many ways, I think, particularly the rhetoric amongst the politicians. And I would look for a rhetoric that would support exactly your substantive policies, but would be a rhetoric of the status of every human being in the society.
Yes.
My favorite catchphrase, you fit to be able to look everyone in the eye without reason for fear or deference. And that applies to every adult, man, woman, those who are less abled and those who are elderly or whatever. And then look at the substantive policies as the requirements for the enjoyment of that social equality. Equality is equals, people who can stand and walk tall, where we all, and that's accepted, depend on the law and the infrastructure of the society in order to be able to look others in the eye without reason for fear or deference. It's just how useful that sort of rhetoric would be, which is a more encompassing rhetoric that would actually support your substantive policies.
So I like that. I will say, again, as you can see, because I come to this subject starting from gender equality, right? So my first, I left you with the idea that if we could simply get people for thinking about care as a human issue and not a women's issue, that would be a huge step forward. But I also think it is critical to ground it in the science. The fact that the neuroscience can show you what happens when a child gets the right kind of care and an elder is I think, for convincing skeptics, very important. I do then agree two things. One, yes, you can't just, these are thought experiments, but to sell them, you should have an overarching concept. And absolutely, as we have fallen radically behind in social mobility, as we are the country of growing inequality, I think that works. The issue of how you characterize the state, people have tried, right? The hand-up state rather than the hand-out state. That's one example where you're just providing people with a hand up. That is a piece that really does need to be worked on. Hillary Cottom wrote a book called Radical Help. And again, she was rethinking the welfare state, and it got a lot of attention in Britain. And she was at odds with her fellow laborites by basically saying, I don't want the state to provide all of this. And she claimed that Malcolm Beveridge in the Beveridge Report really had imagined much more community participation in providing the things that the welfare state provides. So I think there's conceptual work to be done there. But also absolutely rhetorical work on how you characterize the state. And I do agree with the overarching need to have a foundation for the policies.
Right here. You're not from Princeton, are you?
Not from Princeton, from Wannsee. Anne-Marie, you said repeatedly that care shouldn't be linked to women only. True. But couldn't Annalena Baerbock's introduction of foreign politics as feminist foreign politics still introduce some sort of care dimension even to tradition for foreign relations as they were?
Yes, and I just received a book on feminist foreign policy. I don't know where the author is, but she's somewhere in the audience. So I have more reading to do and work to do on feminist foreign policy. My instincts are to take the substance and drop the name, for all the reasons I've just said. I think to the extent, I talk about people and planet-centered politics. There's a lot in what you focus on in feminist foreign policy, including women, but I would say women and men, particularly in sort of a variety of roles. I worry that the label immediately gets you dismissed by lots of more traditional thinkers, and not just men, but other women. But I think there's a lot in the substance of it.
Right here.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very exciting for me to hear. And I'm wondering if it might be useful, in addition to the science and the rhetoric, to throw in a little myth. And I'll reveal my hand as a classicist here. There's been an internet meme going around about how men think of the Roman Empire. But the one myth of a female inventor for humankind is this very rare, obscure story about how Kura, which is care, was the person who picked up the earth and turned humankind. And, it's like a version of the Prometheus myth, but it's not the male scientific inventor. It is Kura, and I'll send it to you because I think you would find it very interesting. And there's a long history of its analysis in Germany, in particular. But there's something. I think this is funny in light of this internet meme of men thinking of the Roman Empire. I heard a radio show where a man called in and said, "Well, why do I think about the Roman Empire? I was driving down Route 1 in New Jersey, and I was thinking that if the Romans had built this road, right, this is infrastructure, right, this would be a much better road." But you can turn to the Romans for the the universality of care as well.
That's fascinating.
I want to add a footnote to that, which is that care is not an entirely positive concept. I think people in policy have made it something of a panacea, but in the history of thinking about care, it has had a huge amount of ambivalence because if you are wrought with cares, right, you're full of worry. And the worrying mother is the one who doesn't give you independence. And there's a complex relationship, at least in the humanistic thinking about care, of care in both senses, as destructive worry and as constructive worry. So I would encourage you and your group, I can send you both some policy things on this, on the ambivalence in the ethics of care, and also some humanistic things that might give some spice to your rhetoric.
So I welcome all suggestions for reading. As I said, this is the outset of a long project, and I would love to do that. I have a section that I've been working on the different ways we use the word care, and it's just extraordinary. I mean, obviously, I care for you, take care, but also, you're burdened down by care, the cares on your. So that in itself, I think, is very interesting. And you saw me emphasize the both and the idea that care must enable independence, and just as independent people can then provide care, but absolutely all of one. I mean, it isn't all good. It has to be married to the other side. But I'd love to see that, and I'd love to see the myth. That's fabulous.
Holly. There are a lot of questions. We can never get out of here.
I'm Holly Case. I really enjoyed this presentation, and I have a couple of questions. One is rather vague, and it's about human nature, because one of the bases you use for kind of making the case for care is human nature. And I'm sure that you've been in classrooms where students have made human nature arguments about why something is possible or not possible, and those arguments make me very nervous. And so I'm wondering if you've had any concerns about basic, sort of leaning into human nature as an explanation. The other one is it's about who does care now, and the relationship of care to migration, for example, both in the United States but also in Germany. as the boomers age, it's increasingly the case that care roles are undertaken by new migrants, in many cases in the United States, not entirely legal.
Yes.
And I wonder how you see this nexus. And on the other side is, you mentioned technology is one of the big markets for robotics is going to be elder care, child care, the care for people in who can't care for themselves. And I wonder if there is a component of this that needs to think technology and care, like, is it different when a robot does it, even if it, like follows all of the human nature type rules, says the right words, etc. And to what extent should we be keeping the human at the center of care, or keeping some version of the human at the center of care?
Yep. So thank you for the first question, and you're reminding me about a very important point. I am not actually trying to make fundamental claims about human nature. I am taking the abstraction of human nature that we have used as the basis for our disciplines, particularly economics, but others, and replacing that with one that is better grounded in the science that we understand. It is still an abstraction, and it's one that we use, because it is resting on claims about the human brain and human behavior and human evolution, but it is not claiming that, this is some essential human nature. And I need to flesh that out. I understand exactly why, those kinds of claims are difficult. That's another reason, though, to ground it in very specific claims in the science, and then point out that we have to use some notion of what a human being is for our policies, and this is at least a better one. The robot question is fascinating. There's a video that was put out by a French religious society about 5 years ago about this woman who, is living in a house in France, and the robot wakes her up, and the robot serves her breakfast, and the end of it, she's dancing with this robot, and it's this, it's obviously anti-technology, but it's in the sense of, this is not a life that you want. You really need human connection. I believe that, but I also think assistive technology for many of the dimensions of care that are very intimate is going to make caregiving a lot better for the person receiving the care as well as the caregiver. There's a lot of evidence, even on something like academic advising, if you merge it with technology. So if you have big data on when students are most likely to drop out, you can do a much better job as an advisor. It's just one example. The question then, though, is care jobs will get better as they integrate technology. They'll be better paid and more valued. That will be harder for the bulk of the women of color, many of whom who are undocumented, who are doing that care. And that is a huge policy debate. Even in my own organization, do you require childcare workers to have BAs? If you do, you're ruling out a lot of people who depend on those jobs. Those have to be hashed out in the normal policy space. What I will say is that the most effective groups on care are representing those women because they don't have a voice in sort of traditional politics. And then the larger immigration question we also have to hash out, but I can't take on.
Professor James.
Another Princeton professor.
Yeah, I know. It's just hopeless.
And apologies for being from Princeton. So thanks. That was really, really wonderful and very, very inspirational. I wondered whether you're including a consideration of how long people need care at both ends of the life cycle, because it seems to me that there's a story over the historical evolution of the last 50 years or so, where children are in care, as it were, for longer. They're teenagers, they're 20-somethings.
They never grow up.
Right. And at the other end, we're healthier at an older age, or many of us are healthier at an older age. And people say that, you know, your 60s are the new 40s or the new 30s or something like that. So, you know, your inspiration of saying we need to keep people connected for a long time is really, really vital, it seems to me. But if you go that direction, you really want to think about the question of retirement ages and when pensions set in. And in Europe in particular, that's a big debate, and it's explosive. It's really explosive. It's very, very difficult to get an agreement on raising the retirement age, and because of the social effects of it. That, you know, some people, you know, maybe if you're working more with your mind, you retire later. If you're working on, the notorious example is if you're working as a roofer in construction work, you don't have that luxury. So there are all kinds of problems, but the basic impulse should be surely to get people to be integrated in the workplace as well for much longer, at both ends of the spectrum, really at both ends of the spectrum.
I agree. And there's a lot of work on exactly, you know, how we evolve for what kinds of care we need. And again, there's older and younger, and then to enable, you know, people from whatever age, let's say 20 to 70, you know, to be in their full sort of individual prime, still connected in various ways, but different ways, and more likely to be caregivers. And I didn't talk about the evidence that says we've evolved to be caregivers. I do think if you think about, one of the things you can think about is how can people work differently? The whole idea of a career and then you retire does not map, certainly even our lives, but certainly not our children's lives. So thinking about, for instance, let's say you retire as the full-time worker, can you stay connected as the consultant? You see lawyers starting to do this. Harder for the roofer, but are there other jobs the roofer can do and still have some kind of social support, but not full pension? That's where I think you're going to have to make the trade-offs, rather than just saying you have to work longer. You're going to work differently at different ages, be connected, and then you're also going to have care that enables you to stay independent as long as possible. That's the piece on the other end. But there are many new care jobs in this model.
Sarah.
Hi, thanks so much, Anne-Marie.
See all my fellow fellows.
A proud fellow fellow. This is a terrific project. And my question is in part about this project and in part about your larger theory of change, given your long career as a policy expert. So one major challenge I think that you're confronting in this project is about cultural attitudes toward care, right? The idea that this is women's work, that the caregiving roles are soft, right? That men don't need to do this work, or if they're doing it, they need to hide it for fear of, you know, taking a hit in the workplace or even in other social relationships. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether specifically on this topic or more broadly, on the relationship between policy interventions and cultural change. And one thing that comes to mind often when I think about this question is something I read that was a discussion by a person who was working on policing. And this person said, you know, we could try to tackle cultural attitudes, right, pervasive attitudes among law enforcement officers toward young Black men to try to get them to stop killing young Black men. Or we could just reduce the number of interactions. So what we're working on is trying to get people to stop using police officers for basic traffic interventions. And so this was a policy intervention that they implemented here in Berkeley, made a huge change, right?
Yeah. Traffic stops.
Traffic stops, exactly. You get rid of traffic stops, and you can get rid of the number of times that police officers are killing, young people of color. And so that I find a incredibly important data point, right? Because it's not about creating cultural change and then letting the political or legal change happen from there. It's just about sort of the blunt policy lever, and then maybe the cultural change happens as a result of that. So if you could share even some of your thoughts on kind of that relationship, I think we would all learn so much from it. Thanks.
So thanks for the question. At New America, we work on the big change, narrative change, culture change that requires a lot of narrative change. I mean, again, the examples, if you think about marriage equality, rather not gay marriage, but marriage equality, how it was framed, and the stories you tell and who tells the stories, and that is a long-term process. So I would say you try to do both in the policing example. If you've got limited resources, yes, you put them into reducing traffic stops, but you do ultimately also want people to see young black men as young men and non-threatening, like we would see any of our sons and sons. So you do both. I do think, if you can find, this goes back to Ambassador Gutman's question, if you can find a particular coalition, as Hillary found support for health care for children, you jump on that, you do it. Any good policy shop is very much in the details of how you can sort of get the maximum effect for the cheapest intervention. And I think you do that. I actually started this project sort of seeing the policy work, because it's there and we're doing it. Lots of people are doing it. I think you're right about young people. But I was thinking, it's not grounded enough intellectually in a way that is robust enough to both teach and withstand the kind of, this was a women's issue. So I was starting from thinking the policy's there, we need to do the academic work. But ultimately, you need all three. You need narrative change, you need policy work, and you got to pay attention to the politics, which is the part none of us want to get our hands dirty with if we're academics.
So can I follow up on the narrative change? So if I were a politician and I was seized with this issue, I would say, where do we see the most dramatic failure of care today? And can we actually describe it as a crisis? And I would cite here the work of yet another Princetonian, Angus Deaton and Ann Casey, on the deaths of desperation and the enormous number of people who are dying ultimately through disconnection, which is then manifested through alcohol and drugs and the opiate crisis. Could that be the thin edge of your wedge? If you were a politician, would you want to take the pulpit and say, this is killing our country?
So that is exactly what the Secretary General is doing with this report on our epidemic of loneliness. And you'll notice I use care and connection, and I kind of slide around because often connection works better for that population. Yes, absolutely. And again, the work of connecting, the work of investing in others and thick connection, I would say, look, this is a crisis, and there are a lot of jobs that we can create there. Equally, as we move toward technology, robotics, but AI, these are the jobs that are much harder for technology to do. So I would also use that these are jobs. The other place that you can really see that there's a crisis, and the military has done this. If we cannot care for and educate, using care as early education, our children better than we are doing now, we are not going to have a competitive military, a competitive economy, or really, frankly, soldiers who are going to be able to use the weapons of the future. And the military has said that. So that's the other place I'd go with this Congress.
All right, well, as long as we're on a Princeton streak, former Princeton, this is Columbia speaking. Okay.
So thank you. My question is that, the wonderful talk you gave seems to me to be primarily outlining a crisis in secular democratic capitalism. In the past, for example, rural but patriarchal families had care systems, very patriarchal. Churches sometimes played the role of the managing of care, not just physical, but allegedly also moral
Pastoral
and theological, pastoral care. The socialist community, the epitome being the Israeli kibbutz, had a notion of comprehensive care. But so you're really talking, I think, about the crisis of secular democratic capitalism. So my question is, given that there is a crisis, is there any secular capitalist democratic society who's doing noticeably better on the care dimension than the broad crisis that I think you have so effectively outlined? Where would we travel to see how to do it better, I guess would be the question.
So I would say it is a secular democratic crisis. It is a crisis it is a casualty of feminism. Right? Yeah, there was great care systems. It's called women. And now we're doing other things. So the point was, if women are going to do the jobs that men have traditionally done, then men have to do the jobs that women have traditionally done. And actually, we have to define these as human again. So that, it's not surprising that care is broken down. The standards, the usual suspects, the Scandinavians,
It must be Denmark, right?
Denmark, Finland. It was interesting. I talked to a Finnish CEO about 5 years ago who said that he now thinks that when one of his workers does not take paternity leave, that's a sign of a defective character. Now we're making progress, right? So you have paternity leave, you're able to go and spend time with your child. And of course, it's hard and boring often, but it is also that sort of core dimension of what makes us who we are. That's the kind of cultural attitude that you're starting to see. And I always point out, Scandinavian men were Vikings, right? They have no problem with masculinity. So I think there's some there. And, look, Germany, France all have better systems than we do, but then they, in general, have better social systems generally. So, yeah.
Okay, so I was hoping to
Mabel's
have a last question.
Mabel.
I want to ask Mabel, but we've had very few German questioners.
Oh, that's it.
Here's a German questioner. And then we'll get to Mabel. We'll go a little long. Mabel's next.
No, you're next.
We're gonna get one more. We'll get two more in. Okay.
Thank you so much. So my name is Katharina Wohlich. I'm actually working at the German Institute for Economic Research, and I'm head of the gender economics group there. So I was listening to your fascinating talk. Thank you so much. And I was thinking very much similar to what has just been said. So Germany has a lot of policies that you've mentioned that would be ideal. Okay, so we have paid parental leave for 12 months.
Yep.
We have free health insurance for all family members. We have sick leave days if children are sick. We have kindergartens. But in terms of gender equality, we do really bad.
Yep.
Much worse than the US.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on that? Thanks.
So Germany's well behind the U.S. in cultural attitudes. When I was dean, I would come here with my husband, and everybody would talk to him, and he would say, "She's the dean. She's my boss." And it's true in Belgium too. I'm half Belgian, and the general view of masculinity does not allow for care. And so partly, if I were thinking about it in the German context, I might not use the word care in the same way. I think it works better, at least in the U.S. context. But a lot of that, I would definitely start with younger men, who I think are some different. But I also think, honestly, you have your parental leave is too long. One of the reasons the U.S. is better is that our parental leave, we don't have it, but to the extent we do, it's shorter, and so women stay in, right? If you're out for a whole year, it is much harder to go back in. If you're out for 3 months, and then you can work your way back in, you're still rising. So there's some policies in Europe that probably with the best of intention, I think actually make it much harder for women to get to the top. And ultimately, you also do need women at the top and men who are similarly minded to change those. So it isn't just the policies.
Well, that's great, because now we have Mabel, who is inevitable.
Oh, I can ask him.
No, go ahead.
Questions from our guests.
Yuta.
I may. And thank you very much. This was fascinating. But I'd follow up on what Katharina just said. I would be a little bit afraid that sort of the care crisis, many people will tell you, and I assume you get that backlash, the care crisis is due to the fact that women want it all. So let's get back the women back into the family and the care obligations. I fully agree it would be great if we could have this utopia, but some of what you say could really be a wonderful excuse for anti-feminism and for sort of putting women back into what is supposed to be their place.
That's what people say. No. I am no stranger to that critique. That's what many people said about my article in 2012. I judged in the U.S. context. I did not think it would go global. I didn't think it would go national. But I judged that women, at least in the U.S., were far enough ahead that we could have this debate. I would not, we've been talking about political strategy. So in the U.S., you could talk about a care crisis. That is not what's motivating this work. What's motivating this work is actually to say, no, this is not just for women to provide. And traditionally, if you look at how we've evolved, women were foragers, right? A lot of the time you had older women and men taking care of children so women could provide the food. And often what they foraged was just as valuable or more valuable than the meat that the men brought home. So it's actually to think through, in terms of both the science and the evolutionary record, a role for care that says it isn't just female. That's what is driving me. And any idea, and it is absolutely against this notion that somehow we women are nurturers and we have babies and we know what to do. Absolutely not. Andy and I figured it out together, and often he figured it out better than I did. So I'm very sensitive to that. I wouldn't start with a care crisis here.
Well, we could go on for a lot longer. This has been an incredible conversation. I apologize to everyone I didn't get to, but I want to, above all, thank you, Anne-Marie, for an incredibly stimulating and exciting talk. And for the future, can we call this the American Academy in Berlin Care Project? Because we'd really like to stay invested with it. And I want to thank you all for coming. Let me just give you a quick look into what's ahead. On Monday, October 23, we will have our John W. Kluge Distinguished Visitor. Elizabeth Economy will be here to talk about United States strategy towards China. Liz Economy is one of our foremost China experts and has been working for the Secretary of Commerce. The following week, on Tuesday, October 31st, is that the following week? Yes, that's the following week. Gosh, how the time flies. We'll have our composer in residence, Camilla Augusta, will give a concert at Kindle, Zentrum für zeitgenössische Kunst in Neukölln at 8 p.m. That's on the 31st. And last but absolutely not least, the following evening, November 1st, David Price, our inaugural Carol Kahn Strauss Fellow in Jewish Studies, will give a lecture entitled What Does Judaism Look Like? The Invention of Visual Toleration in the Enlightenment. That will be here at the Academy at 7:30 on the 1st. Check our website, americanacademy.de, and I hope you will join us either physically or virtually. And again, thank you all for coming. Thank you.